people did something.
And that something made a specific word stitch into people's hearts forever. Terrorism.
Terrorism, in its broadest sense, is the use of violence against non-combatants to achieve political or ideological aims.
And as you can see,
Terrorism is not restricted to one particular ideology, and the term comes with its randomness. Some people believe someone is a terrorist, while the other group hails them as freedom fighters. At this point, I cannot find a perfect transitionary monologue, so let me throw the intro in the dustbin and take a complete detour without any context to the topic of our video, the top 10 deadliest terrorist attacks in history. Number 10. Air India Flight 182 bombings. The 22nd of June 1985, around 6:30 a.m., a man calling himself Manjit Singh checked into a busy line of 30 people for the Canadian Pacific flight from Vancouver to Toronto, which was scheduled to leave at 9:18 a.m. Manjit Singh requested a flight agent to load his suitcase onto the plane and transfer it onto Flight Air India 181 in Toronto. The agent reluctantly agreed as Manjit Singh's ticket was still to be confirmed. At around 9:18 a.m., the Canadian Pacific flight would take off to Toronto without Manjit Singh, but with Manjit's suitcase. The Canadian Pacific arrives in Toronto 12 minutes late at around 4:22 p.m. Some of the passengers and their baggage are transferred to Air India Flight 181, including the baggage of Manjit. While transferring the luggage, the X-ray scanner buzzed a little when Manjit's suitcase was inside, but the buzz was ever so little that the airport security let it slip, and Manjit's suitcase made its way onto Air India Flight 181. The flight takes off to Montreal and lands there around 9 p.m. Here it becomes Air India 182. Around 60 more passengers board the plane in Montreal. The flight Air India 182 was to operate on the Montreal, London, Delhi, Mumbai route. From Montreal, the flight 182 now departs for London Airport. Around 7:09 a.m., while sailing above the Atlantic Ocean, Air India Flight 182 activated its aviation transponder as Shannon Airport Air Traffic Control, ATC, requested, then disappeared from the radar screens 5 minutes later. 7:14 a.m., a huge blast occurred from the luggage area in Flight 182, while the plane was 31,000 feet above sea level. The explosion caused explosive decompression and the breakup of the aircraft midair, and the wreckage fell into the deep sea southwest of the Irish coast. By 7:30, ATC had declared an emergency and requested the nearby cargo ships and Irish Naval Service vessels to look out for the aircraft. All 329 people, including the 22 crew members on board, lost their lives. It was the deadliest aviation terror attack until 9/11's. The attack was by a Sikh separatist group, Babar Khalsa, as a retaliation for the Sikh riots which took place in India after Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was assassinated by her own Sikh bodyguard. More than 1,000 Sikhs lost their lives in the riots. Number 9. Beslan School Siege. On the morning of September 1st, 2004, a group of heavily armed Islamic nationalist guerrillas left their forest encampment in Sadak village, heading toward the town of Beslan. This day marked the traditional start of the Russian school year, and Beslan School No. 1 was filled with over 1,100 people, including children, parents, and relatives, gathered for the celebrations. Among them were men in army uniforms, heavily armed and appearing as well-trained soldiers. Initially, people assumed that they were there for a military drill or protection due to the large gathering. However, at 9:11 a.m., a police van and a military truck rapidly approached the school. More armed men jumped out and charged towards the school, joining the 17 soldiers already inside. Suddenly, the soldiers began firing rounds in the air and shouting for everyone to gather in one place. It became clear this was no drill. It was a hostage situation. All the people were herded into the school gym, and their mobile phones were confiscated. Most of the hostages were school children, many of whom were cruelly tortured. The militants, sent by Chechen terrorist leader Shamil Basayev, demanded the independence of Chechnya. Basayev's demand was simple: declare formal independence for Chechnya, and all hostages would be freed. For the first 2 days, Russian President Vladimir Putin remained silent, almost as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, over 5,000 heavily armed Russian military, special forces, and police surrounded the school. The militants proposed a grim trade-off. For every militant killed, 50 hostages would die. For every militant injured, 20 hostages would die. Thus, no bullets were exchanged for the first 2 days, only tense negotiations. Politicians downplayed the crisis, falsely claiming everything was under control. The militants sent a tape outside showing the dire situation, but officials continued to lie. Inside, the hostages, mostly children, were crammed into the gym, sweating, dehydrated, and hungry, with no food, water, or medication allowed. Even the militants grew tired, burdened by their military gear, some standing on dead man's switches. Basayev had instructed them to listen to Rammstein to stay edgy. On day 3, around 1:03 p.m., a huge explosion occurred in the gym area. Soon a second explosion was heard. It seemed a bullet coming from outside the school had hit the toe of a militant who was standing on a dead man's switch. The switch detonated and a fire erupted in the gym. The militants started to retaliate and a gunfight emerged between the soldiers outside and the militants inside. Amidst all this chaos, the gym's rooftop fell due to all the fire causing one of the walls to collapse. At least 70 people died in this collapse, but it also opened a way to run outside. Those who survived the fall took the chance and ran, but to no avail, they got caught right in the middle of the gunfight. On one side there were soldiers, and in the back, the militants. The entire day went by in all these explosions, fires, and smoke, and when the dust cleared, more than 340 people, mostly children, had lost their lives, with at least 800 or more injured. Number 8. Cinema Rex Fire. The 19th of August, 1978. More than 700 people were watching the newly released Gavazna at the Rex Cinema in Abadan, Iran. It was an evening show. At around 8:30 p.m., 4 men entered the theater to attend the show. At least an hour later, all 4 got up and left before the show ended. Maybe they didn't like the movie, as it was about a thief trying to run away from the police, and how it showed the conditions of Iranians under its ruler, the police brutality brought upon them. Once out, they locked all the doors of the theater from outside and poured a solution of paint thinner and cooking oil on the doorways. One of them then flicked a burning matchstick onto the solution and started a slow fire. That slow fire quickly picked pace faster than the speed of sound, and within seconds the entire theater was turned into a boiling pot, with 700 people trapped inside. It took 6 long hours to put the fire down, but through the smoke what was left was just the burning smell of not only the material of the theater but also that of its people. Over 400 people lost their lives. What happened after the theater attack was a total catastrophe. People took to the streets nationwide to protest, which catapulted into the Iranian Revolution and overthrow of the Iranian monarchs. Number 7. Mogadishu Bombings. On the morning of the 14th of October 2017, a huge truck was charging its way to the Medina Gate in Mogadishu, Somalia. The Medina Gate marked the entrance to the heavily guarded Mogadishu airport compound, the United Nations, most embassies, and the headquarters of 22,000 members strong, the African Union mission in Somalia. Thus, for obvious reasons, the way leading up to the Medina Gate was filled with various checkpoints from the Somalian military. One of those checkpoints was at least 1 kilometer from the Medina Gate. Here, a seemingly overloaded truck covered with tarpaulin raised the military's suspicion. The truck was told to stop, and the driver obliged. For what seemed to be a truck carrying rice, sugar, and other goods, the soldiers never got a chance to examine what was underneath it. Before they could do it, the driver rang a call to a powerful person, and the truck was ordered to let go. Going a bit ahead, the truck was again ordered to stop at another checkpoint, but the driver refused and started to flee. Getting quickly alert, the soldiers fired rounds, and one of the bullets hit the truck's tire, and the truck rammed into a barricade. The place was a busy crossroad near the Safari Hotel, in a Hodan district, just a few blocks from the Medina Gate. Filled with the hustle and bustle of thousands of people, suddenly in a moment of split second, everything went numb. A stroke of excruciating heat traveled 100 meters before the sound of its huge explosion could. Everything was turned to rubles, fire everywhere. The hotel had collapsed, and the people were nowhere to be seen. The truck, which slammed into a barricade, was filled with 350 kilograms of explosives, which took the lives of over 587 people and injured 300 more. Another small temple with explosives was taken into custody just moments before the bombings. Islamist organization al-Shabaab allegedly constructed the terror attack, and the temple was supposed to ram into the Medina Gate, bombing it and making way for the truck to get in. But the plan failed, and the failed plan ended up taking the lives of over 500 people. Number 6, 2008, Christmas Massacres. Few days had gone by since the start of December, On one side, the people of the Haut-Wil district, located in the northeast of the Democratic Republic of Congo, were preparing for the celebrations of Christmas, and on the other side, in the wilderness of the Garamba National Park, just adjacent to the Haut-Wil district, the Lord's Resistance Army, a Christian extremist militancy group, was going through their biggest nightmare. They had become a target of a joint military operation of over 4 national armies and had to run, leave their wilderness cover, and disperse into small groups. These dispersed groups ran into the neighboring villages and killed 2 to 3 people on their way. But those 2 to 3 livers meant nothing to the terror they were about to unleash. Armed with machetes, hammers, axes, and large wooden bats, every single moving thing in front of them had become a target. The people were not just killed, they were destroyed. Their skulls crushed, necks twisted, broken into pieces, raped, tortured, and every single most heinous crime that you could think of, almost as if all of it was pre-planned. The militants, who were dispersed in many groups, all committed crimes around the same time, waiting for Christmas to approach, for people to gather around together in larger groups and then attack. After attacking, they feasted on the Christmas meal, sitting right alongside the bloody dead bodies. At least 620 people were massacred in 3 days, and around 20,000 people had to leave their homes and run for their lives. The attack was not just an attack, but the deadliest in Africa's history and a direct message to the armies of 4 nations. Number 5. 1990 Massacre of Sri Lankan police officers. In late May 1990, the Sri Lankan army found that LTT, a Tamil militant organization, had constructed bunkers, dug trenches, and implemented other defense measures closer to the camps. However, the military was ordered to not take any actions as peace talks were ongoing between LTTE and the Sri Lankan government. The Liberation Tiger of Tamil Eelam, LTT organization, had control over the north and northeastern parts of Sri Lanka and wanted to create a separate Tamil state. Peace talks were indeed happening between LTT and the Sri Lankan government, but the LTT felt it just wasn't going anywhere and was constantly kept in circles. Thus, they decided to take action. 11th of June 1990, at around 6 o'clock a.m. LTTE surrounded the Batakaloa police station and abducted 3 policemen. About an hour later, around 250 armed LTTE cadres occupied the police station. LTTE also removed ours, 45 million in cash, gold jewelry, 109 T-56 rifles, 77 T-84S rifles, 28 light machine guns, and 78 SR-80 guns from the police station. The Batakaloa police station was located in the northeastern part of Sri Lanka, and within the next 3 hours, every police station in the northern and northeastern parts was captured by the LTTE. The cops were told by the Defense Ministry not to fight back, so they followed the order. Around 900 police officers were made into hostages and then taken to the airport, St. Mary's Church, and then finally to the jungles of Trincomalee and Vinayagapuram. At this point, the Sri Lankan government realized that LTTE wasn't here to negotiate anything using the hostages, but they had declared war on Sri Lanka, but it was too late. Once the police officers had arrived in the jungles, the LTTE cadres lined up the officers, tied their hands behind their backs, and shot them dead. In all, 600 to 774 police officers died, marking the biggest terror attack in history until 9/11s. Number 4. Chechnya bombings. Yazidis are an endogamous religious group indigenous to the Kurdistan region of Western Asia, but mostly their settlements are in northern Iraq. Iraq being a Muslim-majority country, tensions within the two groups were bound to happen. There were leaflets distributed in Yazidi towns calling them infidels and threatening them with death. A 17-year-old Yazidi girl was stoned to death by the Yazidis themselves because she wanted to convert to marry a Sunni. In retaliation, the Sunni Muslims stopped minibuses filled with Yazidis and shot dead 23 Yazidi men. The tensions between both communities had reached a boiling point until the final nail in the coffin hit. Planning had begun to vote in December between Yazidis if they wanted to annex their district to the Kurdistan region, which would bolster their power. The majority Muslim population of Kurdistan was furious, and 4 months before the voting, the attack took place. It was August 14th, 2007. The time was 7:20 p.m. The streets of Yazidi towns Chechnya and Jazeera were filled with people during the peak evening hours when suddenly everything was gone. The nearby buildings had collapsed, there was smoke everywhere, and after 1/10 of a second, huge blasts were heard. A total of 4 suicide car bombs had detonated with 2 tons of explosives in the Yazidi towns, killing over 800 people and injuring at least 1,600 more. The rescuers had to dig up the collapsed buildings to reach the burned and broken remains of people. The Sunni insurgents denied the responsibility, but the bombings left a deadly scar in the heart of Iraq. Number 3. 2023 Hamas attack on Israel. On the morning of the 7th of October 2023, at around 6:30 a.m., Hamas released a speech by their commander Mohammed Daif about how Israel had tortured the people of Palestine, Israel's 16-year blockade of Gaza, Israeli incursions in West Bank cities, violence at Al-Aqsa Mosque, Israeli settlers, violence with the army's support, the confiscation of property and demolition of homes, arbitrarily detaining Palestinians for years until they wither from cancer and disease, Israel's neglect for international law, American Western support, and international silence. He then described the operation, that they had drawn the line, and that it was to end the last occupation on earth. Within moments of the speech, over 5,000 rockets were fired from the Gaza Strip onto Israel in just 21 minutes. Explosions were heard from the areas surrounding Gaza to Tel Aviv and Ashkelon, sending the entire country in absolute chaos. In this moment of turmoil, Hamas stormed into Israel with over 7,000 militants from various groups. National Resistance Brigades, the armed wing of the Maoist Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Lion's Den, and many armed Gaza civilians themselves, everyone was there, riding on armed vehicles, trucks, bulldozers, motorcycles, speedboats, and paragliding through the sky. Within an hour, Hamas had taken almost all the checkpoints between Gaza and Israel under their control. The attack was extremely well planned and executed even to the surprise of the United States. It was so well planned that it had to make its way to the Israeli intelligence agencies, and it did. However, the higher-ups in the Israeli Defense Forces were so choked with their egos that they underestimated Hamas's ability to execute the plan and completely neglected the attack's possibility. This neglect would cost Israel dearly. Hamas quickly started taking control over all of the neighboring southern Israeli towns, Kfar Aza, Be'eri, Moshav Yakini, and many more. Steadily, Hamas was moving ahead, and the trail they were leaving behind was full of blood, pain, agony, and destruction. In the Ru'im Music Festival alone, they massacred 364 people and took 40 more hostages. Civilians were tortured and executed in their homes, cars, and on the roads, children in their schools, and soldiers in camps. Women, girls, and men were sexually assaulted and tortured and were taken as hostages. Hamas, like a grim reaper torn into the heart of Israel, killed over 1,139 civilians and took over 250 as hostages back into Gaza. It was the deadliest attack in Israeli history, and one which in the future would cost not just Hamas, but the entirety of Gaza dearly. Number 2. Camp Speicher Massacre. Beginning in the early 2010s, the majority Sunni civilian working-class population of Syria was done with their monarchs and marched for a revolution catapulting into a full-blown civil war. The Syrian civil war had gone completely berserk, causing the deaths of more than 100,000 people and displacing millions of others. However, even while being in the grips of such a large tragedy, the people of Syria didn't give in to extremism. But the extremist Islamic terrorist organization of ISIS did manage to make complete use of the civil war. By the end of 2013, ISIS had taken control over major parts of western Syria and a lot more military gear from the Syrian army. They were ready more than ever and marched for their caliphate. By mid-2014, the Islamic State of Iran and Syria, ISIS, had started small skirmishes along the northern borders of Iraq before beginning an all-out war on the 4th of June 2014. They were stealthy as a cat and quickly captured the bordering towns of Samarra, Mosul, and Tirkut, completely cutting out Iraq from Syria and Jordan. While in Tirkut, on the 12th of June 2014, over 2,000 Iraqi military cadets in Camp Speicher got a message from the higher-ups to leave the camp as soon as possible. ISIS was coming. They ran on a specific route, the route their leaders told them about. It was supposed to be safe until it wasn't. The ISIS militants found them with surprise and with such ease that those who survived the attack believed the Iraqi government itself ratted them out. The military cadets were flocked into trucks like mere chickens and taken to a mass grave in various locations. One by one, more than 1,700 of them were lined up on their knees. Some of them were tortured and beaten to death by rifles, while others took a bullet in the head. Over 1,700 were killed within hours, never to be found, dug into mass graves, and the Iraqi government offered their families condolences and $8,000 as compensation. Number 1. September 11th attacks. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, at 7:59 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 took off from Logan International Airport in Boston. About 15 minutes into the journey, all communications with the flight were lost. While Flight 11 was being hijacked by 5 hijackers, at the same time at 8:14 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 took off from the same airport as Flight 11, hundreds of miles southwest at Dulles International Airport. American Airlines Flight 77 left the runway at 8:20 a.m. For about 28 minutes, everything went smoothly on Flight 175, and within 5 minutes, everyone was praying for their lives. A group of 5 hijackers took over the flight at 8:42 a.m., murdering both pilots and stabbing several crew members before assuming control of the aircraft. At the same time, United Airlines Flight 93 departed from Newark International Airport in New Jersey. The plane was running 42 minutes late. Unlike Flight 11, the Flight 175 hijackers did not turn off the flight's transponder, and the air traffic controllers quickly got to know of the plane hijacking. Equipped with this information, the traffic controllers began contacting various important agencies such as the US Air Force. On the other hand, the air traffic controllers were still trying to figure out what went wrong with Flight 11 when they got a piece of devastating news. Flight 11 was dropping constantly and very steadily in its height, and at 8:46 a.m., it crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York. Chaos ensued everywhere, symbolic of the dark and terrible smoke that engulfed the sky. The office papers were swirling down from the sky, accompanied by burning pieces of furniture and clothes. Soon, the falling of various materials from the building turned into living human beings. They jumped, and the people jumped, from the towers as the excruciating heat and the unbearable smoke were more terrifying than jumping to death. Most people thought of it as a terrible accident. The US president was informed of the same accident, but he continued his program of watching kids learn, thinking of it as just an accident. But few people knew exactly what was up. The air traffic controllers. Now their complete focus was on Flight 175, and they could see the flight changing its direction and heading straight to New York. Within 5 minutes of this, they spotted unusual activity on American Airlines Flight 77 when complete communication with the flight was lost. Back in New York, people and media were still digesting what had happened. Some were in shock, some were in despair for their loved ones, and some were in awe of the spectacle they had just witnessed. What were the odds of witnessing such a massive accident while it was still taking place? But their awe was about to turn into absolute horror. At 9:03 a.m., Flight 175 crashed into the South Tower at an even faster speed than Flight 11. The crash happened between the 77th and 85th floors, and all the tragedies that took place and were taking place in the North Tower were repeated but at an even faster pace. The plane hitting lower than the first one put an extra load on South Tower. With all the jet fuel and steel and furniture and all those flammable materials, the place had turned into a giant poisonous gas chamber. At this point, everyone knew exactly what was up. America was under attack. But what added fuel to the fire was nobody knew to what extent. Was this the start of World War III? What would be the next targets? People were in a complete state of shock, confusion, paranoia, and depression. The air traffic controllers announced every single flight in the US airs to land immediately. The Air Force was ready to shoot down any suspicious plane cruising through the sky. This is when the hijacking of Flight 93 took place. But at this point, the passengers of the flight had talked to their families and they knew exactly what was up. In a brave act of patriotism and brotherhood, all the passengers came together and stormed into the cockpit, forcing the hijackers to nosedive the plane into the empty farmland of Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Just before Flight 93 nosedived into the farms, Flight 77 had been successful in crashing into the U.S. Defense headquarters of the Pentagon, killing more than 125 people and denting a hole in the USA's confidence. About half an hour after the hit at the Pentagon and after all the planes had been landed, the South Tower collapsed at 9:59 a.m. It had been burning for over 56 minutes at that point. 29 minutes later, the North Tower collapsed at 10:28 a.m. All in all, more than 2,977 people lost their lives and more than 10,000 people were injured. Over $10 billion of infrastructure had gone to dust, and the smoke and deadly gases from the site of the attack continue to kill people up to this day. This was the story of the deadliest terror attack in human history.